good to see everyone, and it's especially good to be back with you. It seems like it's been 6 months since I've been here, but I had very good care. Things went well. I appreciate everyone's prayers, cards, texts, phone calls, etc. Your concern that you expressed was very encouraging, very helpful during this time, and I appreciate that very much. We're going to be taking up tonight in verse 9 of chapter 11, I believe, thereabouts. I'm not sure whether you covered it or got to it, but since verses 9 and 10 kind of go together, I'm going to start there. I do appreciate Brian and Jason covering the class in my absence, and I've called upon Jason several times, and I deeply appreciate that very much, your willingness and your capability to do that. And the material, it's on page 34. If you have your notebook with you and you're following that, but again, I pretty much have the slides identical to that. That was for the benefit of visitors. And again, I didn't know at the time whether we would have to do this online because of COVID. You didn't know how COVID was going to go, so I pretty much did the slides as the material is. So, chapter 11, verse 9, and we'll probably get through about verse 8. I plan to tonight of chapter 12. We'll probably finish Sunday, the rest of chapter 12, and that will leave us next Wednesday as the last class. It's kind of going to be a review and an open discussion and just our observations and input of what you've learned from the class, so be thinking about that, okay? I've asked Randy to lead us in an opening prayer, so if you will, let us all bow our heads as he leads us. Amen. Thank you. Okay. Okay, this was working. Okay. Brother Brad, I have technical difficulties.
Okay.
But basically, the first slide was just an introduction. The exhortation to enjoy the days of youth while remembering our obligations to the Creator. That's what verse 9 touches upon, and that thought is going to continue actually through chapter 12 and verse 7. I've included verse 8 for tonight simply because it states Vanity of Vanities, says the preacher, all is vanity. So this is pretty much in line, thank you, sir, with the theme of the book, which is stated at the very end of the book. We talked about wisdom. What is it? It's knowing the end at the beginning. We know what awaits us after this life because God's made it known to us. We know death is not the end of our existence, that is physical death, because God has given us the wisdom to know that there's something beyond the grave. And the same thing in Ecclesiastes. The book is addressing what's the wise way to live your life on earth or life under the sun. Well, he tells us at the very end, the wisest way to do that is to fear God and keep His commandments. And then he tells us why. Because there's going to be a day of accounting, a day of judgment. So, follow your heart is what we're going to be focusing upon tonight. In chapter 11, it talked about that. Follow your heart's impulses. But know this, God is going to bring everything into account. So make your decisions wisely. It's interesting, as we're going to see in a moment, that follow your heart. At times in the Bible, it is said don't do that. But here, it says to do that. And we're going to note that contrast of when is it okay or when is it all right or when should we follow the impulses of our heart or based upon what should we do that, while at other times we should never follow the impulses of our heart. What's the determining factor? So let's begin by reading the last two verses of chapter 11. Rejoice, young man, during your childhood, and let your heart be pleasant during the days of young manhood. Notice, and follow the impulses of your heart and the desires of your eyes. Yet know that God will bring you into judgment for all these things. So remove sorrow from your heart and keep pain away from your body, because childhood and the prime of life are fleeting. Now, there's a couple of questions that I want us to consider. Number one, how do you harmonize the phrase here in verse 9, follow the impulses of your heart, with the same statement in Numbers chapter 15 and the latter part of verse 39 when it says, don't do that? How do we harmonize that? And the second question is, does the next chapter, chapter 12, the first four verses, along with 2 Corinthians 7, verses 1 and 2, and 2 Timothy 2 and verse 22, help us to understand what the preacher said here in verses 9 and 10. So let's first notice the first question. How do you harmonize the phrase here in verse 9, follow the impulses of your heart, with Numbers 15, verses 39b, that is the latter part, where it said, follow not after your own heart and eyes. So let's turn back to the book of Numbers, and I actually want us to read verses 39 and 40. And I hope that as you looked over these passages that I have in the material, that you begin to see the importance of reading the context of the statements that I've referenced in the material. But in Numbers chapter 15, Brother Aaron, if you're there, would you read verses 39 and 40 of Numbers chapter 15? Numbers 15, verses 39 and 40.
You shall have the tassel that you may look upon it and remember all the commandments of the Lord and do them, that you may not follow the harlotries which are in heart in your own eyes are inclined, and that you may remember and do all my commandments and be holy for your God.
Okay, now we're going to notice some detailed words and phrases in these two verses in the next couple of slides. But for right now, I want us to think about what this says in terms of not following the impulses of your heart. Why here Moses told the children of Israel that you're to take certain measures in remembering the commandments of the Lord. And in contrast to that, if you remember the commandments of the Lord, what will you not do? Remember the commandments of the Lord, here Moses said. Do you see that? To do God's commandments. And in doing that, you will not follow what? And again, he repeated that in verse 40. Remember the commandments of the Lord in order that you may remember to do all my commandments and be holy. And so we see this statement here. Now, as we go back, if you want to kind of hold your marker there in Numbers 15, because we will be going back there in just a moment. Why then does the preacher here in Ecclesiastes 11 and verse 9 make the statement, follow the impulses of your heart? Whereas Moses told the children of Israel, do not do that. I know none of us are going to say, well, here's a contradiction. Not a contradiction, but the context, as well as some other passages that we've looked at in Ecclesiastes, help us to understand that in doing right and doing wrong, you're going to be doing the same thing. You're going to be following the impulses of your heart. So what's the difference? One way you sin, one way you won't. Any thoughts?
A couple things here. The end of verse 9, it talks about how, remember that God's going to bring your acts into judgment. So even in following the desires of your heart and all that, keep in mind that it needs to be in accordance with God wants. But then you look at verse 10, and it's talking about removing grief, anger, and pain in your body, and sort of enjoying the prime of your life. And, that seems to be the focus there, not necessarily fulfilling your own wicked, sinful desires, but being able to find enjoyment in a time of life where you have, less, I wouldn't say difficulties, but there's probably more to enjoy.
Let's consider a couple of previous verses in the book of Ecclesiastes that I have on the material. We have chapter 8, verse 5, and chapter 10 and verse 2. I think these two verses are key to helping us understand the difference in what Moses said in Numbers 15. Don't follow the impulses of your heart, whereas here in verse 9, follow the impulses of your heart. So let's notice Ecclesiastes chapter 8 and verse 5. Remember what we read earlier? He said here in Ecclesiastes 8 and verse 5, he who keeps a royal command. Now remember, Numbers 15 talks about remembering to keep the Lord's commands. What does the preacher say here in chapter 8 and verse 5? The person who keeps a royal command, what will that person not experience? Evil. New American Standard says that person will not experience trouble. We've talked about, you mentioned a troubled life. He mentions in verse 10 things that causes pain. So there will be no evil experienced if you keep a royal command, because he goes on to say in chapter 8 and verse 5 that a wise heart understands the proper time and procedure. Remember God in chapter 3, there is a time that God fixed and appointed for everything under the sun. A wise heart recognizes God has fixed things, and he ought to follow God's instructions. And he knows the proper procedure. He understands that in doing that, God has given commandments. How many times in the book of Psalms do we read passages that are, in essence, teaching what chapter 119 and verse 105 says? God's word is a lamp to my feet and a light to my path. Many of the Psalms imply or outright state that. And the 119th Psalm just speaks over and over about commandments, keeping them, following them, the benefit of it. So we have here in chapter 8 and verse 5, if you basically, is that not saying if you will obey God's commands, you will not commit sin? You will not know evil. You will not know the consequences of evil, of committing sin. So if you have a wise heart to do that, follow the impulses of that heart. What will you never know? What he says here. Now, if your heart is foolish and you choose to ignore that, that's what Moses was talking about. Remember the Lord's commands. Don't follow the impulses of your heart. Now, let's go back there and notice another phrase that I didn't touch upon. In Numbers 15, verse 39, Moses said, remember the commandments of the Lord so as to do them, and not follow after your own heart and your own eyes, after which you played the harlot. So what kind of a heart do I have? Do I want to do wrong? Satisfy the lust of the flesh? Don't follow the impulses of that foolish type of heart. But if your heart is drawn to keeping the Lord's commandments, then enjoy your life. That's what God meant. Recognizing you're here for your life as a vapor. You're here, there's a day of accounting coming. Okay? That's chapter 8, verse 5. Now let's notice chapter 10 and verse 2. Notice he's talking about the heart. What does he say in Ecclesiastes 10 and verse 2 that we studied just recently? A wise man's heart, what will it direct him to do? Which direction will it point him? To do what's right. To remember the Lord's commandments, to do them. A wise heart will direct you to do that. Do you have a wise heart? If so, enjoy life doing that. Now, if you want to find joy doing the other thing, the foolish man's heart directs him toward the left. This is simply pointing about the right and the left signify being obedient or committing sin. So what makes your heart? What determines whether your heart is wise or foolish?
Your actions. One, how you've been taught, what you've learned, your experience.
And what are you going to do with what you've been taught? What if you've been taught wrong and you follow it? Is there going to be a problem? So, learn what the Lord said. Compare that to what you've been taught. If you find there's a variance, what's the wise choice? Which one should you follow? Stick with what you've been taught or follow the Lord's commands? You'll follow the impulses of your heart. Either way. The question is, what kind of a heart do you have? The preacher in chapter 11 and verse 9 says, you follow the impulses of your heart, young man, but know this, God will bring you to judgment for your choices. And isn't that what the last two verses of the book says? God will bring everything, whether it be good or bad. So this is what I came up with in this first question. Anyone have any comments?
The Bible heart is the mind, isn't it?
Pardon?
The Bible heart is the mind. So the mind is controlled by your thinking. And the way you think is how you experience life and what you've been taught, really.
And it gets back to something, I don't know if it was who brought it up. It might have been Sam. We have a free will. We make choices. Those choices that we make reveal whether our heart is a foolish heart and we want to satisfy ourselves, or whether our heart is a wise heart and we take into consideration God's wisdom. Follow your heart, the preacher said. But know this, you're going to give an account of it. So be smart in your choice. That's in essence what he's saying here, okay? Anything else any of you have before we go to chapter 12, where this will be continued? Okay. First, let's notice the second question before we go to chapter 12. The second observational question was, does chapter 12 and the first 4 verses and 2 Corinthians 7 verses 1 and 2 and 2 Timothy 2 and verse 22, are they teaching the same thing as verses 9 and 10? So I have kind of a little parallel here. Verses 9 and 10 said, follow your heart. But notice, remove vexation. You see that in Ecclesiastes 11, verses 9 and 10? Follow your heart, So remove vexation from your heart and put away the pain from your body. That's what verses 9 and 10 says. Now, Ecclesiastes chapter 12, in the first 4 verses, basically, to summarize that, he says, remember God, that is God's commands, while you're able. He's going to go on to talk in these first 4 verses. The days will come when you won't be able. You're going to have pain, hindrances, things that bring you sorrow. Before those days, you need to be prepared. So remember God. That's the same thing as follow your heart. And remove these things that will prevent you from obeying God. Remember God's command. What did the Apostle Paul say in 2 Corinthians 7, verses 1 and 2? Basically, he said, cleanse yourself. That is, remove certain things and bring holiness to completion. Follow your heart. But do you have a wise heart? If you do, you will do this. You will cleanse yourself of infirmities, things that will hinder you from being obedient. Passages like from the book of Hebrews, lay aside every weight and the sin that besets, so that you can do what? Fear God and keep His commandments. He goes on to say, in doing that, you will bring holiness to completion. Then Apostle Paul said in 2 Timothy 2 and verse 22 to Timothy, he said, flee certain things and pursue certain things. Is that not the same thing that he said here? Follow your heart, remove vexation. And is that not what Moses told the children of Israel to do? Remember the Lord's command, follow not your heart to play the harlot. Remember to do God's commands. The bottom line is, do you see that all of these passages are saying the same thing? They're another way of saying, fear God and keep His commandments. In order to do that, you need to remove things that will tempt you to satisfy the lust of the flesh. Because there's a day coming that you will give account of everything you did, whether it be good or whether it be bad. Do you have a wise heart? Following our heart, we're going to be wise or foolish. We need to choose in view of the judgment. Okay? Any thoughts, questions? Let's go on to the chapter 12 then. He's continuing this thought of remembering our obligations to the Creator, and it will continue through verse 7. Verse 1 of chapter 12. Remember also your Creator in the days of your youth. Notice before the evil days come and the years approach, when you say, I have no pleasure in them. Now, I want us to notice, first of all, these two phrases that are underlined. We're going to notice in more detail here in a moment how that this word evil, the word evil, if you looked back at the beginning of the material when we were going over some significant terms, one of those terms was evil. Don't think of evil every time you read that word in the Bible as committing sin, because it doesn't always mean that. There are a lot of words in the Bible translated evil. This word here in chapter 12 and verse 1, when it's talking about before the evil days comes and the years approach, when you say, I have committed sin, no. When you say, I have what? No pleasure. And go ahead, Aaron.
In the New King James, in place of evil, it uses difficult days.
Difficult days. That kind of corresponds. When things are difficult, boy, is that pleasurable? No. So what causes in our life us to get to the point, and don't think of it in terms of physical age, what brings us to a point in life that we just do not Life is not pleasant. Maybe what would happen that's caused us a lot of regret. What type of things happen that we have no pleasure? The days are evil. They are unpleasant. They are difficult. And this is exactly what Job chapter 30, verses 16 and 17 is talking about here when it says, before the evil days come, he's talking about days of darkness, days of affliction. Chapter 11 and verse 8, he mentioned days of darkness. This is the same meaning here as evil. Before the evil days come, or the days of darkness, days of affliction. Think about in your life, maybe within your family, within that circle or whatever, but I'm sure for those of you that are parents, what's brought you affliction and regret, and you just find it difficult to enjoy your life as a Christian? What's generally always been at the root of that? Somebody committed sin, either yourself, may have been a child, may have been because you've had to separate from family because of religious differences. The days are just days of affliction. They are days of no pleasure. They are days of darkness. He says here, remember God before those kind of days come. Days that I believe you would agree with. You have, especially if it relates to a child that's not living as they should, what's the first thing a parent's going to question about themselves?
Where have I gone wrong?
Days of affliction, days of difficulty. It's hard to not say, where did I fail? Many of those days will fill our lives. Will they not? Because where are most people going to be in eternity? God has told us. Let's not think that all of our blood relations are exempt from what Matthew says in chapter 7. Wide is the gate that goes to destruction. How many will be there? And so that's a concern. So this is what he's talking about here. But on the flip side of that, your obedience, we need to remember, our obedience to God should be a life that brings us joy, that gets us through these days of difficulty. Serving Christ should not be a miserable way of life. Not that we won't be plagued with having pain. The evil days here, in other places, this word evil is translated with the word bad. Sometimes it's translated with the word unpleasant. The idea is, in those texts, those contexts, that he's saying, remember your Creator before days come that give you pain, that bring you unhappiness and misery. And again, that's generally because sin has been committed. This is why God subjected our world that we talked about at the very beginning of the class, Romans chapter 8. Why did God subject the creation to vanity? Man sinned. And that brings these days. These days are many. They are numerous. Prepare for them. And when you're obeying God, I can tell you from experience, and I'm satisfied many of you can say this, staying with God, staying the course, that's what gets us through these dark days, don't it? We reflect, we ponder, we think about the promises of God. Someone dear to me may not make it, but what gets me through these difficult times? Jesus has gone to prepare a mansion. Keep pressing on. We think and we read of others when we study who suffered a lot worse than we did. They stayed the course. Obedience is worth it. Obedience is worth it. So as we go on, a key word in verse 1 of chapter 12 is this word remember. This is what helps us to get through these periods of life when something or someone else is causing us a lot of pain and misery. Our hearts bleed for someone who is lost. Remember. How so? In what manner? We need to remember in this way, the very way that God remembered. And I have 4 examples here. And then a thought question. We need to remember our Creator in the same way that God remembered us. Okay? And then we're going to notice in a moment the thought question, how does remembering God benefit or prepare us for these days of evil or these difficult days? Okay? So let's notice these examples. How did God remember? That's how I'm to remember. Let's notice an example of Hannah in 1 Samuel chapter 1 and verse 19. You recall Hannah? She was childless. What did she want? So bad that she prayed and prayed and prayed and prayed. She wanted a child. Now, you think she would have done that if she didn't trust in the Lord? To remember what He had said in the beginning of the foundation of the world, that He will come to the aid of those who put their trust in Him. Noah found grace in the eyes of God. Why? Because God had purposed, when man obeys me, what will I do for him? I will hear his prayer and answer as it is needed. I will give him strength in the day of trouble. All through time, God has promised from the foundation of the world that He would do this. And so Hannah prayed. She put her trust in God to fulfill His promise that those who fear Him, their prayer will be heard. Now you think about this, and this is just some food for thought that I'll give you to chew on and study on your own. Why did Hannah want a child? Why did Hannah want this child? Because we know what she was going to do. The divine record has told us. What did she say? God, if you give me a child, this is what I will do with that child. Anyone recall? And it is a great lesson for a parent. Pardon? You give me a child, I'll see that he serves you. I will give him back to you. Why did we want to have children? Was that our goal as a parent? You bless our marriage with a child, I will do as Hannah. And we need to teach our children that when you get ready to start dating, and then you think about marriage and you think about having a children, we need to point out, why did Hannah want a child? What did she say? God, if you'll do this for me, this is my commitment. I will give him to you. And did she do that? She sure did. God remembered Hannah's prayer. God remembered because Hannah put her trust in God. We need to remember our Creator in that way. God will fulfill His promises. Okay? What about Cornelius? Cornelius, we're told, feared God, prayed always. What did God remember because of that? He had purposed to send Jesus to die just for the Jew. For whom was Jesus purposed to die for, class? John 3:16. All of us. That's why Cornelius' prayer was heard. The prayer didn't save him. but God remembered. His prayers went up as a memorial, and God remembered what had God purposed to do for all humanity. Forgive through His Son. And so He fulfilled that. God remembered in that way. Our remembering is to be as God's remembering. God did what He purposed from the beginning of time. He shows mercy to those who fear before Him, and those who do not, He has said, you don't obey me, there will be consequences. So we go on in the Lord's Supper. In the Lord's Supper, there is a remembrance from Luke chapter 22 and verse 19. There is this remembering of what Jesus did for us. And then in Jude chapter 1 and verse 5, gospel preaching bears out that those who do not obey God, they will be punished with everlasting punishment. God remembered His word, and He has kept true to His word. He comes to the aid of those who fear Him. He will save them. He will deliver them. He will be with them through the days of darkness if they prepare their heart to serve Him in youth. He will carry them through the tough times when He is executing judgment on the ungodly. Think of this story in the Bible, in Numbers, when the 40-year punishment was pronounced. There was 12 spies. Did 2 of them bring a good report? But did those 2 that feared God, Caleb and Joshua, did they have to suffer through the 40 years? They sure did. But did God bring them through it? What happened to the rest of the nation that left Egypt? They all perished in the wilderness. But God, even though Caleb and Joshua had to go through that troublesome time, God delivered them. That's what God will do for us if we have a wise heart. So remember the deeds of God in the days of your youth, before the days come that you have no pleasure. When you look back over your life, and your life is, all you can say is, I just regret how I've wasted it. So this is what we have in this. Now, let's notice this next question. How does remembering God prepare us for these difficult days? I kind of summed it up with my thoughts that what God has promised to do for those who fear Him, He has always done, and He will continue to do. That will get you through these days of darkness, these days when you say, I'm not enjoying what's going on around me. When you're tempted to give up, throw in the towel, what keeps you going? Remember the promises of God and God's faithfulness to His word. So remember God in your youth, because these days of evil, these days of difficulty, these days that bring us no pleasure, they're going to come, just like they came upon Caleb and Joshua. I'm sure Adam and Eve grieved over the death of Abel. Would they have not? Why did God put His prophets like Daniel through the 70 years of Babylonian captivity? Daniel was faithful, but he had to go through that. Difficult days. All that are godly in Christ, what are they going to suffer? Those days of coming. Our life in Christ, our life as a Christian, is going to be filled with many days of persecution. Every day is not. There are days that we don't have that. They're very pleasurable. We just enjoy our family. Things are going great. And then one phone call, one day you get up, something hits your health. What have you? When a family member suffers, all of a sudden the happiness is gone in your life. Do you give up serving God? Do you, as we studied in previous classes, do you wish I had never obeyed the gospel? What will prevent you from doing that? Remembering the promises of God. Okay, we got to move on. Verses 2 through 5. Remember your Creator in the days of your youth, before the sun and the light, the moon and the stars are darkened, and the clouds return after the rain. On the day that the watchmen of the house tremble, and strong men are bent over, when the grinders stop working because they are few, and those who look through windows grow dim, and the doors on the street are shut as the sound of the grinding mill is low, and one will arise at the sound of the bird, and all the daughters of song will sing softly. Furthermore, verse 5, people are afraid of a high place, and terrors on the road. And the almond tree blossoms, the grasshopper drags itself along, and the caperberry is ineffective, for man goes to his eternal home while mourners move around in the street. These verses are talking about the difficulties associated with days of darkness. There is just no pleasure. Choose early in life and stay the course to remember God and keep His commandments. And then verse 6, because this kind of gets us to what I want to cover before tonight's over. Verses 6, 7, and 8. Remember your Creator before the silver cord is broken, before the golden bowl is crushed, before the pitcher by the spring is shattered, before the wheel at the cistern is crushed. Similar to what we read in verse 1. Verse 7. Then the dust will return to the earth as it was, and the spirit will return to God who gave it. Similar language as in Genesis 3:19. Futility of futilities. All is futility. Do you see in verses 7 and 8 a description of death? That's what these phrases mean. When things are broken, things are crushed, shattered, and the dust returns to the earth as it was. Man, we were made from the dust of the earth, weren't we? And God breathed into man's nostril the spirit of life. When that spirit returns to God, this is talking about remember God before you die. That's all it's saying. I don't remember who said it, but is that me? Anyone hear that? Good, I've got it muted. My phone's going off. It has been stated, how futile to have lived and not to have known the key to living. Tragedy of tragedies, a great waste. That's basically what these verses are saying. Remember the Creator. Difficult days will come. What will get you through them? Do you have a wise heart to know enough that as difficult as the time I'm going through, like Caleb and Joshua's period in the 40 years wandering, like Daniel's time in the 70 years of captivity and the other godly people, why didn't they quit? Why didn't they utter, I wished I had never become a prophet. I wished I had stayed in Egypt. Hank.
When you build your house on sand and the storm comes, it washes away. If you build it on a rock, you're stable. That's what this reminds me of.
And if you build your house on a rock, follow your heart. If your heart wants to be in heaven, enjoy your life. It's not that you can't find joy in the midst. That's why when we're at a funeral of a fellow saint, in the midst of our tears, inwardly are we rejoicing that brother, that sister's race is run. They've left us under the sun with hope of heaven. There is joy to be found even in days of difficulty. And we don't have any regret for that person. That's the motivation, that's the drive, that's wisdom. That's what God says. Remember me early in your life. I will help you through these days. And rest assured, I will give you what I purpose for you in the beginning of time, and that is eternal life. Hope the class was enjoyable. Mark chapter 9, or not chapter 9, verse 9 of the last chapter, and Lord's willing, we will finish chapter 12 Sunday, okay? Thank you.